The year was 1876. Across the rugged peaks of the Balkan mountains, the heat of a restless spring was eclipsed by the gathering smoke of insurrection. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had maintained a fragile hegemony over the diverse peoples of Southeast Europe. Through a combination of administrative complexity and the threat of overwhelming force. However, the system was fracturing. In the village of Batak, nestled within the Rhodope Mountains, the air grew heavy, not with the scent of pine, but with the metallic tang of impending slaughter. Ottoman irregulars, known as the bashi-bazouks, moved through the mountain passes with a singular and grim purpose. They were the blunt instruments of an empire pushed to its financial and political breaking point. Facing them were the disorganized but fervent Bulgarian revolutionaries. These were men who had traded their plows for rifles in a desperate bid for autonomy against a state they viewed as an exhausted predator. This was not merely a local rebellion. It was the spark that would ignite a continental conflagration. The geopolitical stakes were immense. If the Sultan's authority collapsed, the resulting vacuum would draw the great powers of Europe into a ruinous struggle for the spoils of the East. The fragile peace established decades earlier, after the Crimean War had vanished. In its place stood the cold reality of bayonets and burning hamlets. Decisions made in the remote highlands of Bulgaria would soon echo in the palaces of St. Petersburg, London, and Berlin. Welcome to our video on the Great Eastern Crisis, a series of uprisings and diplomatic failures that shattered the Ottoman grip on the Balkans and paved the road to the First World War. The survival of an empire often rests on the clarity of its long-term strategy, a principle that applies as much to historical statesmanship as it does to the way we build this channel. To continue producing these deep dives into the mechanics of history, we rely on the support of our community. On Patreon and through YouTube memberships, we offer an extensive library of exclusive content that goes beyond our regular uploads. Our supporters have access to full-length series, including the Pacific War, where we track the naval and island-hopping campaigns in exhaustive detail, and our comprehensive coverage of the Punic Wars, analyzing the titanic struggle between Rome and Carthage. Other deep dives include the Reconquista, the Russian Civil War, the Spanish War of Succession, and the North African campaign of the Second World War. These series are built with the same commitment to logistical and tactical accuracy that you see in our main videos, providing hundreds of hours of additional analysis for the serious military history enthusiast. By joining, you also gain access to our community Discord server and the ability to vote on future video topics and series schedules. Early access to new scripts and behind-the-scenes updates are also available. You can find the links to support us in the video description below. But to understand how these Balkan fires grew into a global crisis, we must first look at the decaying foundations of the Ottoman state. The mid-19th century was a period of agonizing transition for the Sublime Porte, emerging from the Crimean War with a renewed but hollow sense of security. The Ottoman state found itself ensnared in a web of modernizing ambitions and ancient systemic flaws. To compete with the industrial powers of the West, the Sultanate embarked on a path of rapid, debt-fueled military and naval expansion. Massive ironclad warships were purchased from British yards, while modern Krupp artillery pieces were ordered to fortify the frontiers. Yet, the fiscal engine required to sustain such a machine was archaic and brittle. Centralization efforts often backfired, leaving the provincial administrations both more oppressive and less efficient. In the Balkans, where a patchwork of ethnicities and religions lived under a social contract that was rapidly dissolving, the burden of this modernization fell most heavily upon the Christian peasantry. Trade routes remained active, But the wealth they generated rarely reached the rural interior, which remained locked in a feudal-like cycle of subsistence and high taxation. The concert of Europe, led by Britain and Austria-Hungary, sought to preserve the territorial integrity of the Ottomans as a bulwark against Russian expansion. But this geopolitical stability rested on a foundation that was already crumbling from within. The year 1874 brought the breaking point in the form of environmental and economic catastrophe. A series of poor harvests and natural disasters swept across the Anatolian heartland and the European provinces, devastating the agricultural base that provided the bulk of state revenue. Faced with a looming bankruptcy and the need to service its massive foreign debts, the Ottoman treasury took the ruinous path of increasing the tax burden on the already suffering peasantry. In Herzegovina, the pressure became unbearable. By 1875, local farmers refused to pay and took to the mountains, launching a localized revolt that quickly spiraled out of administrative control. This was not a unique event, but the timing was fatal. In October of the same year, the Ottoman state officially defaulted on its international loans, effectively cutting itself off from the credit markets of London and Paris. The empire was now both broke and burning at the edges. Discontent spread like wildfire through the Bulgarian lands, fueled by secret societies that had spent decades planning for such a moment. The sick man of Europe was no longer just ailing. It was undergoing a systemic organ failure within the Ottoman capital. The crisis precipitated a brutal political struggle that would eventually see three different sultans occupy the throne in a single year. The traditionalists and the modernizing young Ottomans clashed over how to suppress the unrest, while the military leadership grew increasingly paranoid of foreign intervention. On the other side of the border, the Russian Empire watched with opportunistic intent. Tsar Alexander II, though personally cautious and wary of another total war with the West, was under immense pressure from pan-Slavic circles within his own government and the Orthodox Church. They saw the suffering of their Balkan brethren not as a domestic Ottoman issue, but as a moral crusade for Russia to fulfill its destiny as the protector of the Slavs. Meanwhile, the Bulgarian Revolutionary Central Committee sought to turn the localized unrest into a national war of liberation. They understood that their own forces were insufficient to defeat the Imperial Ottoman army in a pitched battle. Their strategy was more subtle and more dangerous. They would provoke a reaction so severe that the European powers would be forced to intervene on their behalf. The point of no return arrived on April 20th, 1876. In the town of Koprivshtitsa, the revolution was proclaimed prematurely when a local rebel shot an Ottoman official, allegedly using a letter signed with the man's own blood. The April Uprising was born from desperation and a lack of coordination, yet its impact was immediate. While the initial rebel successes were limited to seizing a few mountain villages and disrupting local communications, the Ottoman response was dictated by panic and a lack of regular troops in the region. To crush the rebellion quickly, the Porte authorized the use of bashi-bazouks, irregular volunteer units often recruited from local Muslim populations who felt threatened by the Christian uprising. These units lacked discipline, uniforms, and mercy. They moved into the rebellious districts with instructions to pacify the land at any cost. A strategic loop was now open, while the Sultan's irregulars moved to extinguish the fires of revolt. A much larger storm was gathering in the north, where the Russian army began a secret mobilization that the Western powers had yet to fully perceive. The decision to use irregulars had solved a short-term tactical problem, but had unleashed a logistical and moral nightmare that would soon make a general European war a mathematical certainty. The Ottoman response initially relied on the bashi-bazouks, irregular volunteer units, numbering between 10 and 20,000 men, largely recruited from the local Muslim populations of Pomaks and Circassians who had been settled in the region after the Crimean War. These forces were not a professional military corps. They provided their own horses and weaponry, which ranged from modern Snyder-Enfield rifles to traditional scimitars and pistols. Their doctrine was not one of maneuvering for territorial control, but of rapid, terror-driven pacification, aimed at breaking the civilian will to resist through the total destruction of rebellious centers. These irregulars operated with a lack of central oversight that encouraged local commanders to settle old scores and secure loot, turning a military campaign into a campaign of displacement. Eventually, they were reinforced by regular Nizam infantry, who were better disciplined and equipped with the superior long-range Peabody Martini breechloaders. These regulars moved along the newly constructed railway lines, utilizing the telegraph to coordinate their movements with a speed that the rebels could not match. Opposing them was a fractured assembly of roughly 10,000 active insurgents, organized into local secret committees and semi-autonomous military districts. Their equipment was a testament to desperation. While some possessed modern rifles smuggled across the Danube from Romania, many carried antiquated flintlocks or were reduced to using sharpened agricultural tools and the iconic, yet largely symbolic, cherrywood cannons. In the village of Bratsigovo, a lone carpenter worked through the night to bore out a cherry log, his hands trembling as he applied the iron hoops that he hoped would stand against Ottoman steel. The revolutionary network had spent years stockpiling black powder and lead in secret caches beneath church floors and in mountain caves, but their numbers were consistently thinned by the need to protect their families in the valleys. Bulgarian doctrine relied on the occupation of defensible mountain villages and the construction of wooden barricades. They operated without a professional officer corps or a standing cavalry, meaning their ability to react to Ottoman flanking maneuvers was almost non-existent. They fought with the knowledge that retreat was impossible. The theater of operations was defined by the rugged Sredna Gora and Rhodope mountain ranges. Steep ridges and narrow limestone gorges restricted the movement of large formations. Dense beech forests provided cover for the rebels. The early spring of 1876 brought erratic weather, with sudden mountain rains turning the unpaved roads into impassable quagmires of mud. Visibility was often hampered by morning mists clinging to the valleys. The land was a maze of verticality and shadow. Urban density was low, with the conflict centered on isolated, stone-built villages that had been transformed into makeshift fortresses. Command psychology was dictated by extreme pressure and mutual misunderstanding. Ottoman leaders like Ahmed Aga were fueled by a volatile mix of religious fervor and the urgent political mandate to decapitate the rebellion before it could invite Russian observation. They were reckless and thorough. On the rebel side, leaders like Georgy Benkovsky possessed a messianic confidence. He believed their sacrifice would force the hand of the great powers. They were idealistic but strategically isolated. Benkovsky famously remarked that his goal was to open a wound in the heart of the empire that would never heal. This was a clash between an empire fighting for its survival and a people fighting for their birthright. On the afternoon of April 20th, 1876, the town of Koprivshtitsa became the epicenter of a geopolitical earthquake. The initial contact was not a clash of grand armies, but a frantic skirmish between local constabulary and a small group of determined conspirators. When Todor Kableshkov, the local revolutionary leader, shot the Ottoman mudir on the stone bridge of the town, he immediately dispatched a messenger to the nearby revolutionary center of Panagjurishet. This messenger carried a letter signed with the blood of the slain official, an act of symbolic commitment that left no room for retreat. Within hours, the bells of the mountain churches began a rhythmic, mournful tolling that signaled the general mobilization of the Bulgarian peasantry. The response from the Ottoman authorities was swift but disorganized. In the nearby administrative center of Tatar Pazarcik, the local governor, lacking sufficient regular troops due to the ongoing tensions on the Serbian border, issued an emergency decree calling for the assembly of the bashi-bazouks. These irregulars, largely drawn from the local Pomak and Circassian villages, began to coalesce into raiding parties of several hundred men each. By the morning of April 22nd, the first Ottoman vanguards had reached the outskirts of the rebel-held territory. The revolution had transitioned from a secret conspiracy into a kinetic conflict across a front spanning over 80 miles of rugged mountain terrain. By April 24th, the opening engagements had crystallized into a series of desperate defensive stands. The rebels had established their headquarters in Panaguricate, where they had gathered nearly 5,000 volunteers and civilians behind a series of earthen redoubts and wooden palisades. The Ottoman irregulars, now numbering over 10,000, launched probing attacks against the mountain passes at Petrik and Aledjik. Here, the technological disparity of the conflict was laid bare. As the bashi-bazouks surged up the slopes, they were met with the thunderous but erratic fire of the Bulgarian cherrywood cannons. One such gunner, a village wheelwright who had spent weeks reinforcing the hollowed-out log with iron bands, watched as his weapon belched smoke and stones into the advancing ranks. The effect was psychologically jarring but tactically limited. The smoke from the black powder hung heavy in the damp mountain air, obscuring the vision of the defenders and allowing the Ottoman skirmishers to crawl within range of the barricades. The Ottoman lines held. The rebels fired back. The mountain slopes grew red. A line of bashi-bazouk cavalry swept through a gap. The first barricade was overrun. The defenders fell back to the town square. The pivot moment of the uprising arrived on May 1st at the village of Batak. While the main rebel forces were occupied with the defense of Panaguricate, a force of roughly 5,000 irregulars under the command of Ahmed Aga moved to encircle this secondary stronghold. The Bulgarian defenders, consisting of about 1,000 local men, had positioned themselves within the stone walls of the central church and the surrounding sturdy houses, believing that the Ottomans would respect traditional centers of refuge. However, the Ottoman tactical reality had shifted. Ahmed Aga realized that a protracted siege would allow the rebellion to attract the attention of the European consuls in Plovdiv. He ordered his men to abandon the frontal assault and instead utilized local guides to move small detachments along the ridgelines above the village, effectively cutting off the only path of retreat into the higher mountains. Just as the rebels prepared for a night breakout, a column of regular Ottoman Nizam infantry arrived from the south, bringing with them two modern Krupp mountain guns. The rebels had expected a battle of musketry. They were instead met with high explosive shells that shattered the stone walls of their sanctuary. The tactical hinge had turned. The defense was now a trap. The line of the Strepska River was bypassed. The village was completely surrounded. The collapse of the uprising followed with brutal efficiency. By May 4th, the primary rebel center at Panaguricate was under heavy bombardment. The sight of the Nizam regulars, with their disciplined volleys and bayonet charges, broke the morale of the ill-trained revolutionary militia. As we saw in our coverage of the siege of Sevastopol, the introduction of professional, long-range rifled fire against improvised fortifications inevitably leads to a rapid disintegration of the defense. The Bulgarian lines, once defiant, now melted away into the dense forests of the Sredna Gora. The rout was total. Encircled detachments were hammered by continuous fire, while the bashi-bazouks moved into the captured villages to ensure that no pocket of resistance remained. The communication between the revolutionary districts was severed as the telegraph lines were repaired and guarded by Ottoman cavalry patrols. The cherrywood cannons, so central to the rebel identity, lay split and abandoned in the mud of the mountain passes. The revolutionary high command, including Georgy Benkovsky, was forced to flee with a dwindling bodyguard of 60 men, pursued relentlessly through the rain-slicked gorges by Ottoman scouts. The final actions took place in the deep wilderness of the Balkan mountains. Benkovsky's so-called flying detachment was intercepted on May 12 near the Kostina River, in a sharp 5-minute exchange of fire. The revolutionary leader was killed, and his followers were either captured or scattered into the brush. By the middle of May, the organized military phase of the April Uprising had effectively ceased. The Ottoman tally of the campaign was staggering. Over 60 villages had been reduced to ash, and the irregular forces, now largely beyond the control of their officers, continued to scour the countryside for survivors. The death toll among the Bulgarian population was estimated in the tens of thousands, while the Ottoman regulars had suffered fewer than 500 casualties. The rebellion had been decapitated, its leaders executed or in exile, and its strongholds erased from the map. Yet, as the smoke cleared from the charred ruins of Batak, the tactical victory of the Sultan's forces was already beginning to transform into a catastrophic strategic failure. The numbers on the battlefield were clear, but the numbers of the dead would soon be counted by a much more powerful audience. The cost of the suppression was staggering, with contemporary estimates placing the civilian death toll between 15,000 and 30,000 Bulgarians. Over 80 villages had been reduced to smoldering ruins, and the cattle and grain supplies of the fertile mountain valleys were thoroughly plundered by the irregulars. The revolutionary leadership was annihilated. Those not killed in the initial fighting were subjected to public executions or sentenced to life in the fortress of Acre. Ottoman casualty remained negligible, but the physical security of the region was bought at the price of its total economic devastation. The mountain passes were silent, the bashi-bazouks were eventually withdrawn, the land was pacified. This tactical victory rapidly transformed into a diplomatic catastrophe as news of the massacres reached the Western press. Journalists like Januarius Macgahan and American consul Eugene Schuyler traveled through the ruins of Batak, documenting the piles of unburied dead and the charred remains of schools and churches. These reports ignited a firestorm of public outrage in Great Britain, where William Gladstone used the horrors to challenge the pro-Ottoman policy of Benjamin Disraeli. The British government, traditionally the primary protector of the port against Russian ambition, found its hands tied by a voting public that could no longer tolerate an alliance with the Sultan. Deprived of British support, the Ottoman Empire was left diplomatically isolated exactly when the Russian Empire chose to act. The April Uprising served as the direct precursor to the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, a conflict that would fundamentally redraw the map of Europe. The following year, Russian armies crossed the Danube, supported by thousands of Bulgarian volunteers, who saw the invasion as the fulfillment of the revolution's goal. The subsequent Treaty of Berlin in 1878 resulted in the creation of a semi-independent Bulgarian principality, effectively ending 5 centuries of direct Ottoman rule in the heart of the Balkans. This collapse of the regional order created a volatile landscape of competing nationalisms and overlapping territorial claims. These tensions would fester for decades, eventually providing the powder keg for the Balkan Wars and the global conflagration of 1914. The logic of empire had failed. National identity had triumphed. The strategic loop, opened in the north, was finally closed when Tsar Alexander II, citing his duty to protect the Orthodox Christians, officially declared war on the Ottoman Empire in April 1877. The secret mobilization we noted earlier had evolved into a massive tidal wave of steel and infantry that the bankrupt Porte could not hope to withstand alone. The fragile alliance of the great powers had shattered, replaced by a raw struggle for territorial dominance that marginalized the very people who had started the fire. While the revolutionaries of Koprivnica had sought a local liberation, they had instead invited a geopolitical storm that would consume the old world. The stage was now set for the decisive clash at Plevna, where the fate of the Balkans would be decided by the modern machinery of industrial war. In our next episode, we will follow the Russian imperial armies as they cross the Danube to confront the Ottomans at the legendary fortress of Plevna, where a desperate defense and innovative trench warfare will once again shift the balance of global power. If you found this analysis of the Great Eastern Crisis informative, please subscribe and press the bell icon to stay updated on all our upcoming historical documentaries. We extend our deepest gratitude to our patrons and YouTube members, whose continued support makes these long-form series possible. You can find links to our Patreon and exclusive membership perks in the description below. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.